So welcome to today's Joint Commission Scrutiny meeting with Children, Education and Communities and Health and Adult Social Care Policy and Scrutiny Committees. My name is Jane Mellor and I'm the Democracy Officer for this meeting. The first item on the agenda is to elect a chair. So could I have any nominations, please? Councillor Doty.
I'd like to nominate Councillor Daubney, who's chair of the Children Education and Community Policy Committee, as his committee began the scrutiny review. I think it would make sense for Councillor Daubney to chair the meeting. I'd be very happy to be vice chair if members were happy with that. If there were any technical issues, we lost Councillor Daubney.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder?
Yeah, I'll second Councillor Daubney as chair and Councillor Doughty's self-nomination as vice chair. I'll do all that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. So, Councillor Daubney, you're the chair.
Thank you very much, Jane. Good evening, everyone. This is a public meeting of the Commission's Joint Committee of Children Education and Communities Policy Scrutiny Committee and Health and Adult Social Care Policy Scrutiny Committee. Today's date is 28th February 2022, and it is just after 5:30 p.m. You'll all be aware that despite the relaxation recently in COVID regulations and restrictions, today's non-decision-making scrutiny meeting is being held remotely, pending an imminent review of these arrangements. Welcome to everyone joining us virtually, therefore, tonight. Members, those presenting reports, our guests, and those viewing proceedings via the online link. Members of the two scrutiny committees and other councillors present are denoted by letters CLLR before their names. Can I ask officers and external attendees to introduce themselves with their names and job titles this evening when they first address the scrutiny committee, please? In terms of apologies, I have apologies for Councillor Fiona Fitzpatrick, Councillor James Barker, Heidi Hayward of Door 84, Sean Balsam and Roger Newton of Healthwatch York. Are there any other apologies, please, for the minutes? Okay. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest from council members, please? Don't see any. Councillor Doughty.
Thank you. I don't see it has any real prejudice, but my partner is a former chief executive of York Mind, who are represented this evening.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Webb.
Yeah, I don't think it has any impact, but since I'm with new people tonight, I am a teacher at a school in York, and I imagine that some of the services that we're talking about tonight will be delivered in schools in York.
Thank you very much, Councillor Webb. Item 3, public participation. We have one registered speaker this evening, Councillor Pete Kilbane. Good evening, Councillor Kilbane. You have 3 minutes to address the committee. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you, Chair. Thank you.
Splendid. I should give you a warning, as usual, 30 seconds before the 3 minutes are up. And over to you, Councillor Kilbane.
Great. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for this opportunity to address the committee. Members, we have a generation of children who, in the words of the Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza, are veterans of a global crisis. COVID has taken a huge toll on our young people. We know that during the 2021 lockdown, the number of children suffering serious mental health problems rose by 77%. A recent survey of 1,000 York children conducted by the Children's Commissioner showed that with 23% of respondents, they were unhappy with their own mental health. This is a staggering and tragic statistic. If we are entering a post-COVID period, then the picture still remains unclear. What the report before you tells us is that demands for CAMHS will increase. Some progress is being made, and we have nothing but praise for all of the dedicated professionals working in this field, but it needs to be better funded and easier for young people to access. Waiting times for access to mental health support services is still too high. Waiting times for assessment of ADHD, for example, is around the 9 months mark, but this is only the beginning of the process, and accessing care will then take a much longer time. Similarly, waiting times for autism assessments in York are also too high. Lack of quick access to mental health support in schools can lead to an increase in exclusion for what is deemed challenging behaviour. Clearly, the pandemic hasn't helped, but if pupils' needs are not being adequately addressed in line with the Early Help Care Plan entitlement, this does start to become a human rights issue. We know that historic underfunding has limited the CAMHS provision available in York, and this has led to service rationing. We all wish this was not the case, but given that it is, it needs to be a lot clearer how this rationing is being decided. For example, we need open data to be made available from and between the NHS, TUV and the CCG. There is a resultant lack of data at local authority level, and this means that your job of scrutiny is made more difficult. It also means that us councillors, as responsible parents to our growing number of children in care, cannot necessarily target support in the best way. To finish, Chair, I would just like to ask scrutiny to address a few of the key questions arising from the report. Are CAMHS coping with the level of referrals they receive, and are these referrals appropriate? How are we staffing to support young people? For example, do we have the right number of psychiatrists and mental health nurses in the appropriate settings? What are we doing to support young people with eating disorders? Do children and young people get to access the services they need the first time they present, or do they have to keep telling their stories over again every time they engage with services? To finish, Chair, I wish you well in your deliberations this evening and hope this committee can help us ensure that we utilise the resources that we do have available to best support our children and young people. They are veterans of a global crisis and they have borne much of the brunt. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Councillor Cobain. Your comments will be taken into account when these matters are discussed. Thank you again. You continue watching the meeting via the live stream, of course, as you well know. Thank you. I just wanted to give the committee a little bit of background. On the 7th of December 2021, an interim report on children and young people's mental health by a review group made up of Councillors Baker, Webb, Vassy and Heaton from both CEC and HASC scrutiny committees was brought to the CEC Policy and Scrutiny Committee. That interim report was largely complete, but the intention is that the material from tonight's meeting, together with our discussions, will be used to finalise the report before it returns to CEC for scrutiny for approval, with a recommendation that the report goes on to executive. A bit of a diary entry. There will be a further meeting of the joint HASCPSC Commission Scrutiny Committee on 17th of May to consider the autism strategy. Item 4, reports. There are a number of reports from officers and external attendees tonight. I propose to take each report in turn and then invite questions of the authors before moving on to the next, which I hope will break them up slightly and make it easier for people to remember what questions they want to ask. Can I first of all, therefore, thank the authors for their report and invite Susan Duval, Commissioning Manager for NHS Fell of York CCG, and Jamila Hussain, Director of Prevention, Commissioning and Education and Skills, City of York Council, to present their report on the emotional and mental well-being of children and young people as agenda item 4, please. Susan.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, Jamila is going to start off the discussion on this item.
Right, that's fine. Jamila.
Hello, everyone. Whilst I've got the report in front of me, I can't see any hands, so please shout out if there's anything you want to ask while Sue and I go through the report. So we brought this report on the request of members of this committee to outline the issues facing children and young people in the city and what as partners we are doing to help support that with the jointly commissioning services and other services that will support early intervention and prevention to stop children reaching crises and going into CAMHS. I think Councillor Cobain in his early speech sort of discussed around CAMHS and children waiting for CAMHS, and hopefully this report will cover some of the questions that Councillor Cobain raised. But initially just to talk about the structure of the report. So the report is going to cover the national and local policy, because it's really important that we understand, you know, nationally what the policy is going forward. Mental health disorders in children and young people. As Suzanne and I felt that there was some confusion around mental well-being and mental health assessment, and the Mental Health Act and the Mental Health Act assessments in children and young people. The impact on the COVID-19 pandemic, what is on offer locally, and some of the gaps and the challenges that we will outline in the report, and what the future might look like. So I'm just going to open it up to round out the national context. I think everybody might be aware of the Future in Mind document that came out in 2015. And this document really focused on prevention and promotion, particularly in the early years, the first 5 years, and the early intervention programs that we want to sort of make sure that we build on and bring in within the City of York, which we have done already. We've got lots of support going into schools around mental well-being, and also around some of the services that we've commissioned with Mind. And also talked about the right support for vulnerable children and vulnerable groups, and good workforce planning. And we'll talk about workforce planning as Susan goes through the report around, and Carol, around what we're doing to support the CAMS offer, but equally how we're galvanising some of the third sector to help us support this. So Future in Mind did come with some funding to CCGs to locally promote this, and that was invested, and the council alongside this invested in the school wellbeing service. The school wellbeing service is still in place, and recently NHS England and Innovation supported a programme called Mental Health in Schools, which has started in York as well this year. In 2019, the NHS published the long-term plan, so we call it LTP. This set out some specific targets. It set out that 35% of pupils should have access to NHS-funded mental health support. So that's a target that's been set in the long-term plan. It doesn't actually say 100% or 70%. It's 35% in that target, and that's what a lot of services are commissioned, especially health services, are commissioned to support. And then the 35% of children with a diagnosable mental health disorder to have funded by the National Health. And another specific key option here was around digital access, ensuring children and young people and parents can access digital information 24/7, and also and on a phone line to actually speak to somebody if they need support. So the LTP did expect that systems work together, hence the local authority and the CCGs, as well as providers, working together to bring in clear commissioning arrangements and clear services that support our population. We have done that. We are continuing to do that through our joint commissioning policy. And we brought in what's called the I Thrive model. And this builds on the Future in Mind work, and also the long-term plan around early intervention, getting help, getting more help at an earlier stage, working with the council through that early help, but equally with CAMS through their services around first. So if I move on to you, Susan, if you want to explain the Mental Health Partnership Board, and then moving on to Carol with the mental health disorders, if that's okay.
Thank you, Jamila. For the record, my name is Susan Duval. I'm Commissioning Manager at Vale of York CCG. My remit covers commissioning for mental health, autism in children and young people, and special educational needs and disabilities. I think that we are looking in this report at some of the issues around what we have available, what the offer is locally for children. And we referred to the report at paragraph 30, which sets out in diagrammatic form the offer for children and young people in the city. We've adopted what is known as the I Thrive model, and that is a model built around domains of support which are intended to ensure that children whose needs are kept in line at all time are able to thrive. So depending on what their need is, whether that's universal advice and information that's readily available to any child, whether that's some targeted help that is available to them as part of an offer, whether it is more specialist advice, for example, in the CAMS, through CAMS service, or whether their needs represent significantly high risk. But what we've done with paragraph 30 is outline for members the way the structure of local services operates. So we have the services, we have commissioning organisations across the top, and we have the offer that is available for them below that, and then just turning over the page slightly, we can indicate where services are jointly commissioned currently between the City Council and the CCG. I think what we do see from this is rather a mixed picture, particularly in relation to health commissioning, because of the differences in terms of responsibilities as between the CCG and NHS England, which retains commissioning responsibilities, for example, for inpatient units and certain other very specific services. What we also see in relation to that is the increase in levels of demand across all these domains of provision. This is something that we know from the pandemic. We have seen every single one of these commissioners or organisations or sectors see an increase in demand over the last 2 years. Carol will be able to talk more detail about the demand for CAMS. Members will see that we do have set out some of the information from the School Wellbeing Service regarding the increase in demand for their service over the last couple of years compared to the pre-COVID position. And we are already seeing the mental health support team, known as Wellbeing in Mind, which is operating in 7 schools plus York College in the city, that having started work in January of this year, they are also seeing high levels of demand for advice and support from children within those schools. I think that it might be helpful here if we put up the information from Carol on current levels of demand through CAMS. I have put some figures in the report. My figures run from the last couple of years up to Q2. Carol has more up-to-date information, and I'm wondering if we could put those through now.
Susan, I'm happy to talk through the slides, but I actually don't know how to share on Zoom. I'm not familiar with it. Right. Are you happy to do the slides?
So Susan, do you want to conclude our report, and then that presentation might be really helpful?
Okay, so, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Because as we get
indeed.
to the sort of bits about where we are and our next steps, because I think maybe the committee would want to ask something about our next steps. What
I've put into the report is an outline of areas that are causing concern at system level. And remembering that mental health is everybody's business, it's a system level response to the needs of emotional and wellbeing needs of children. Those are set out in the annex in some detail, but the main body of the report looks at paragraph 38 and sets out some of the discussions that we have been having and the issues we have been considering in terms of what some of the issues are for future provision and future working. It is acknowledged that there needs to be a much higher level of integration and close working between various providers of support, advice and services in the city. And while the funding for such integration is limited, some of the issues that we are looking at, and we can see from paragraph 40 onwards, using the iThrive model in terms of developing the web-based offer, as has already been mentioned, looking at some of the principles around single gateway to avoid having to tell it multiple times, considering further how counselling is integrated into a broader offer, and how we make better use and of the skills and the abilities of the third sector. I think I have to say, and we are all agreed, that third sector engagement in emotional and wellbeing over the years has just not been as good as it should have been, and we have not taken advantage of the skill set and opportunities that the third sector offer in York. There are some specific groups of children with high levels of need we need to think about more, noting children who are looked after and children on child protection plans, and considering what the offer is in relation to specialist teachers. SEMH and ADHD in particular are areas where we don't have sufficiently strong teaching support into schools, unlike autism, where we have the autism teaching team within the City Council. And then high risk support, and I in fact was at a meeting this afternoon talking about how to develop an intensive home support service for children with eating disorders, and how we look at the first offer within the neuro pathway, because the demand for high level support for children with autism who are experiencing extreme anxiety and distress is now outstripping the resources that we have available to work with them. So that, I think, is probably all I need to say about that at the moment. We can pick up other matters in questions from members.
Yeah, and Susan, I was just going to conclude to say the report is really clear and transparent, and we're really clear from COVID and then coming out of COVID, although we call it the recovery, but it's not quite a recovery. We are seeing a high number of children experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety within the school plate. So we're seeing now some of that's affecting our attendancy, so we're keeping an eye on that. So we do know, as commissioners together, health and social care, that we need to look at doing things slightly different, because it's not about children reaching that crisis. It's how we can support them lower down, and that early intervention and prevention area of working with the third sector. So the report is really clear that there are some issues there, and there are some challenges for ourselves as commissioners of how we're going to bring in services that will meet the ever increasing need at the moment.
Right, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jamila, for a very comprehensive report. I can see quite a few of my colleagues are indicating they wish to ask a question, so I'm going to take them in order. Councillor Heaton, over to you.
Thank you. One very quick one, and then, well, hopefully two very quick ones, actually. Paragraph 30, where it's talking about where the services are. It obviously references Vale of York CCG there. Now, given that the CCGs aren't going to exist beyond, at this point, the summer, where exactly are those services going to be and dealt with, just for clarity there?
Thank you very much, Councillor. The commissioning arrangements for health are changing. CCGs are due to be dissolved. The current date is 1st of July of this year. They will have, their place will be taken by the Humber Coast and Vale Integrated Care Board and the Humber Coast and Vale Integrated Care Partnership. That will be working across Humber Coast and Vale, which, as members are probably aware, covers an area from the north of North Yorkshire down to including Cleethorpes, Grimsby, and across to Scunthorpe. The Humber Coast and Vale will be split into two areas, one of which is North Yorkshire and York, and the other is Humber. So North Yorkshire and York, part of Humber Coast and Vale, will itself operate as a subsystem, and within that there will be two places. The City of York will be a place. Now, we now move into slightly uncertain territory because the ICB board is not yet fully appointed. It is expected to start working in shadow form from the 1st of April this year. What we are expecting, however, is delegation of certain functions and budget to place boards. And for York, we have already in place and functioning the Health and Social Care Alliance, which works between the City Council and the CCG. and is already working on priorities and joint working to take forward a range of issues as they affect health and social care in the city. Children's mental health is one of the priority areas for the Alliance in terms of how it wants to promote joint working and decision-making around investment within the city. So that is the way that it will work. So anything at the moment under paragraph 30 that's called Vale of York CCG will move to Humber Coast and Vale Integrated Care Board. And it's also worth noticing that some of the NHSE commissioning functions are also moving to Humber Coast and Vale, particularly the provision of inpatient beds, that's CAMS Tier 4. Members, of course, know that Mill Lodge is a CAMS 4 unit locally, but it's always important to point out that CAMS 4 units are not local, they are based locally and can take children from anywhere in the country.
Thank you. Excellent. And then just the second one there, performance targets. I think it was you, if I remember right, Jamila, who was speaking to this. The 35% target, you can see from the report that TUV are operating at 45%. When we're looking at commissioning, are they fully commissioned to operate efficiently at those levels?
TUV were commissioned for specialist CAMS before these targets were introduced. These targets were introduced in 2018. No, sorry, I
19.
These targets were introduced initially in 2016. The 2019 long-term plan reiterated the 35%.
Yeah.
So TUV have been operating in excess of the target since 2016. 2016, the target was 32%. TUV at that stage operating at around 40%. So TUV are operating at approximately the level they have been doing so throughout the period of time of these targets, and that subsequent to their acquiring the CAMS contract in York.
Thank you very much.
I would also point out that the 35% target is not exclusively for specialist CAMS service. It's available to any service that treats, that responds to diagnosable mental health conditions. And there are up and down the country a number of third sector organisations and local authority services which deliver in accordance with the mental health target of 35%. For example, I commission a third sector service in North Yorkshire, which itself contributes towards the achievement of the 35% target. But TUV's performance, it is TUV's performance that is reported in this report.
Lovely, thank you very much. Councillor Doughty.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to just open with a couple of thoughts and then lead to a couple of questions from that, if I may, Chair, please.
You may indeed. Yes.
Yeah. Firstly, I'd just like to thank Susan and Jamila for presenting the report, and there's some very interesting information within there. I'd also like to thank the scrutiny review members. I had sight of the draft December report, and I think they ought to be congratulated on the work that they put into that, because it's a very complicated area. And I mean, from experience, we know it makes sense to say some things are a whole system, and this certainly should be the case. But the reality is, with a system as fragmented as ours is at times, this can sometimes, I think, mean that nobody ultimately takes responsibility for certain things. Even if they're part of the system is the area that they're accountable for. I think with this in mind, it's also helpful that we need to be clear in language and separate the concerns that we have into different areas, because obviously when we're talking about children's mental health, there's a whole range of things. So we could be talking about children's emotional development or children's well-being, children who are actually mentally ill, and children with severe mental illness. So they're all very different things. And I think some of the labels can be difficult to hear. And we need to be extremely careful about labelling people, as well as inappropriately medicalising the day-to-day struggles of growing up. So I think they're all very different things, and we've got to be careful with that. So from that, a couple of questions. And I appreciate you may not have seen, you might not have all seen the draft, the scrutiny draft, but there was a paragraph in there referring to a cut in children's mental health workers. And I just wanted to understand a little bit more from that, whether that was a CYC or a CCG cut, and wondered whether it's a question of it was a fixed term project, or whether it was a deliberate decision to reduce support for children and young people in York. I don't know whether you're able to help with that.
I can certainly respond to that. I am not, there has been absolutely no decision or move to reduce levels of mental health support in the city. I mean, from a CCG position, we've probably invested close to an additional £1 million into specialist CAMs since 2018, and with the sole intention of increasing staffing levels, increasing access and quality of support. So I certainly could not recognise such a statement in relation to CCG commissioning.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, within the council, we haven't decommissioned anything at the moment. In fact, we've extended our offer into schools in particular, and also with young minds. So we're going to have to take that back and have a look. But certainly, from my recollection, we've actually invested and not de-invested.
Sorry, just one thought. I mean, services vacancies, but vacancies are absolutely not coexistent with a planned reduction in staffing numbers. So I think, yes, I think we need to unpick that one a little bit further. Chair.
Just reference, it was paragraph 22 in that draft report, Jamila, if you want to take a look at that when you have an opportunity. Appreciate you can't do that now, but it did reference that. And as I say, it might be that there was a fixed term project that relates to, and that could be something completely different. Well, it's something coming to an end rather than actually, deliberately losing staff, for instance. So it might be something as simple as that. But I just wanted to have some clarity on that. And then I appreciate that there was a summit of system leaders a fortnight ago for York and North Yorkshire. I'm guessing you probably both at that meeting. I just wondered what was discussed and what developments are to come out from that, please.
It was a very well attended summit, so it was with all partners, and we discussed what the future of children's mental health would look like as a whole system approach to that. And key areas went away to say what are we going to do in the immediate future, and what are we going to be looking at commissioning further on in the future. So North Yorkshire and York. So from a York perspective, we're really going to, in the short term, target a specific area, some school that we know has got some specific issues around emotional and mental health, emotional and psychological well-being of their young children, and we've got high levels of children who are not attending school due to that. And we're going to do a targeted approach around CBT and positive behavioural support, and look at how we can then bring in a model that we could model that across the rest of the schools in York and children and young people. We also discussed what would a single pathway of support look like, from all the way from early intervention to tier 4? As Susan mentioned, what we want to do is reduce the number of children who actually access tier 4 services. So there's a full action plan that will come out of the summit. As soon as the action plan is out, we're happy to share with you, because it will have clear targets and deadlines for us as providers. But it was much more of a whole system approach with ourselves and North Yorkshire and Tuve, as well as the CCGs, and clear then forward plans for us to really start to redesign what we have to offer at this moment. I don't know, Susan, if you wanted to add anything more, because you were there as well.
No, I think that's a good summary. There has never been any doubt that the various partners within the system want to work together, and that has always been the case. I think that the arrival of COVID in the last few years has emphasised just how quickly change can be made for beneficial effect, and the growth, the development of the ICS approach, now the ICB across Humber Coast and Vale, has itself served, certainly within health, to promote and encourage and now facilitate through structures formalised approaches to joint working wherever it is possible to do so, and will achieve beneficial outcomes and improved outcomes for children or other sectors of the community. And I think that it's very important to recognise that the summit was absolutely committed to those principles, and then starting to look at something that could be done in concrete terms to see how to develop something at pace that would have a positive impact as a pilot, to see how it could be run out across the city. I think of the example a couple of years ago of Early Talk for York, which started as a pilot in the Westfield area and is now rolling out across the city for early communication.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can I pass on to Councillor Webb now, please?
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to everyone who's been involved in writing this report. And I think it's worth saying that the draft report that Councillor Doughty's just mentioned, I want to be really clear, the only reason it is a draft report was essentially because it was written by members in the scrutiny subgroup. So it wasn't written by officers, it wasn't written by, shall we say, impartial experts. It was written by politicians. So that's why it is a draft, essentially, because it's not necessarily impartial, but it was certainly the impression that we got from meetings that we'd held across the year. And I felt that it was a good summary of what had been discussed with various agencies and various individuals. But we would really welcome, and that's the purpose of tonight, is to almost give this an official CYC stamp, so we've got something minuted that we can go forward with. I think a few questions, really. I've got quite a number of questions, but I think the thing that shocks me about this report is that, you know, Tuve are working at 45%, working with 45% of young people who they could be working with, and they're above the target by 10%, which, you know, means that 55% of possible cases are not being dealt with, and I think that's a concern if that's what that means, and I think we should probably have a look at that. And then I've got a few sort of specific questions on the report. Paragraph 15. It says, which are more difficult to analyse as the incidence of risk factors such as deprivation in the local population have an impact on the numbers with diagnosable illness. So I was wondering if you could explore that a little bit and explain what that means. Paragraph 27, and actually this really goes across the report. We've talked about commissioning in the third sector and not utilising the third sector enough. I wonder if you could outline how that works and how we get a fair spread when, you know, we might not have the right provision in the third sector in the city. In the table at paragraph 30, in the bottom left corner, it says educational psychology, advice only service. was wondering why that advice only bit is in there. You know, what's the detail that we actually need? And then I think, for me to finish, really, the one thing I would say is there isn't a lot about waiting times in this report, or the answer to the question that was asked about, do children tell their story once? And I know that when speaking to children as part of the subcommittee, that was a real concern that they had, was, are they telling their story once? So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot there, I know, apologies, but please go on.
Thank you, Councillor Webb. You've outlined, hang on a minute, and look at my white piece of paper, 1, 2, 3. You've outlined a few points. I'm going to pick up the points regarding socioeconomic factors. I will also pick up the 55% point, socioeconomic factors. I've got the point about the Educational Psychology Service, and I think Jamila can pick up probably discussion around the third sector and the role of the third sector and how the third sector can be brought in. I think as Carol here is here, may be able to talk a little bit about waiting times and so on, if the report doesn't have enough information in it. The 55% that aren't covered don't, and it goes back to the point I made just earlier. CAMS are a major contributor to the target of 35%. Other sectors can contribute to that target. It's a bit of an administrative process, but they can contribute to that. Third sector, locally, York Mind contributes to achievement of the target of 35%, if you like. So they are there in the calculation somewhere. They will be able to advise how the third sector can be more involved in this, and involving the third sector more would also help with contributing towards the achievement of that target. At the moment, we are putting our eggs not entirely, but our eggs are substantially in Tube's basket in relation to the national target. And of course, we want to over comply, and we do. It's how we can over comply even better. The socioeconomic points referenced in paragraph 15, we put it in rather a shorthand, because if one looks at the National Prevalence Survey from 2020 and 2021, there is a lot of information in there about how socioeconomic factors and risk factors and protective factors play into the assessment of the percentage of children with mental health disorders. Poverty is a huge contributing factor, and that isn't absolute poverty. That's low income. Both families just about managing, the families who are just above levels of state support. We see poor housing can be a contributive factor. We can see that unemployment is a contributing factor. We see that family background can be a contributing factor. Poor caring of the child is a contributing factor. So there are a whole host of these factors that come into play that enable an area to determine for itself what its rate, if you like, of emotional and mental health disorders is likely to look like. The outsider looking at York would say it was going to be very low, because York does not have a high level of socioeconomic deprivation factors within it. But of course, there are hidden pockets within the city, and there are other factors beyond simple economics that come into play here. So it's quite a broad range of factors. My colleagues in public health would be better able to give a longer and a better response to that, but we can certainly provide something further for members in relation to the outline of all the factors that come into play, in individual family factors as well, that protect or expose children to risk, are also there. So it's a very wide canvas on which we operate in relation to emotional and mental well-being. But the aim has always got to be to have the way in which we address emotional and mental well-being at the earliest stage possible and from the earliest time possible. So this isn't about looking entirely at children who are, say, of school age. This is looking at how we look at the emotional and well-being of the child 9 months before the child is born. So maternal mental health, parental mental health, caregiver mental health and factors, and then infant mental health, which is a very undeveloped area. It's often played out through perinatal support for mothers with pre-existing severe mental health disorders, but in fact, it's beyond good parenting. It's about attachment and bonding for the infant with their caregivers that will enable them to develop the resilience and confidence to address difficulties in their lives as they arise. So we are looking at very, very early stages right the way through a child's life here. This isn't about what happens when you start school.
Thank you very much, Susan. Can I turn now to Councillor Taylor?
Thank you, Chair. Much appreciated. I've got a couple of questions. First, I just want to open up by saying that I totally support the sort of early prevention focus. It's the right way, but with that, I think it's pretty depressing. The sort of state of affairs across services. And all politicians who've had anything to do with starving services and people from what they need to get help should be ashamed over the last 10 to 12 years. My two questions are firstly related to paragraph 9, which talks about a new partnership group being set up in 2021, focusing on children's health and well-being. And I'd just like to know what this partnership group has achieved so far. I mean, I'm not sure what time in 2021 it was set up, whether it was early or late in that year. And the second question I've got, I don't want to sound too flippant here or a bit like a Luddite, but I do know various references to sort of support through websites or self-help forums. And my sort of non-expert and probably getting old now reaction was, would young people who are in need of mental health support, for the most part, really sit on these websites and self-help forums? Or do they need a proper expert sat in front of them, supporting them with face-to-face, more tangible support? I'm sure some will prefer the sort of virtual route, but I just get a bit nervous with any sort of undue reliance on a web page. I mean, it must have value, I'm sure, but that has to be limited. And so I'd like a bit of clarity on that from any professionals. It might be able to offer some reassurance on the benefits of that sort of offer, or even sort of being open about its limitations, just to reassure me that I'm not being too cynical or negative, which I am prone to in today's day and age. That's my lot, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Taylor.
Yeah.
Councillor, sorry.
Do you want us to come back on that, Chair, or
yes, of
do you want
course.
us to wait?
Sorry,
So,
I was.
So I will leave the Mental Health Partnership Board to Susan, because that's developed and in its place. But just in terms of a web-based program, we don't solely rely on those. That is just part of a package of support, because some children feel much more comfortable in accessing websites in the first instance, but it doesn't replace counselling services and an emotional wellbeing face-to-face support services that children and young people receive. For some children, they found it really useful during COVID times, but as we're coming out of COVID, we're finding that more and more children do want to be able to either virtually or face-to-face see individuals. And this comes back to the question one of the councils asked around third sector support. because we're looking at more early intervention and prevention models, is around how we develop the third sector fully. We've got York Mine, but equally we need to look at how we can support services around that I Thrive model of getting help and getting early help. And we don't totally rely, counsellor, on the website. It's part of a service that children and young people can get. And there's some information around there on there for parents as well, of how they can support young people who are feeling, who are experiencing emotional distress.
Chair, if for me, with all due respect, Jamelia, I wasn't saying that services solely rely on web-based support. I get that. I can read the paper. My question was specifically, though, about that part of the overall offer and how useful or effective it was. I'm quite aware that there's much more out there than just websites.
Yeah, so websites are useful. So we will still continue to fund them, because we do get feedback to say that they are useful in terms of early access to the right information, but they're not, as you say, counsellor, then they're not, they don't replace any counselling intervention.
Would it be fair enough to say, Jamila, it's more for information purposes than actual advice?
It gives information and advice. I know Susan wants to come in. It does support information and advice as well to young people and parents, but it doesn't substitute face-to-face counselling. Susan, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
Yes, I think that when we talk about websites, it becomes shorthand for the digital offer. And the digital offer essentially has two components. One is websites, for example, Young Minds or BEAT, which is the National Eating Disorder Charity, or other readily available and trustworthy online resources, some of which are co-produced by young people and are very effective at giving high quality information and some guidance for children and young people. The other half of the digital offer is digital delivery of specific support, whether that's one-to-one advice, one-to-one counselling, or group work. Two of themselves have a standard offer for low mood and anxiety, which is around group work in the first instance. There is also a standard offer at TUV for parents in relation to advice and information around autism. We also have the ICS, Humber Coast and Vale, was commissioning for a while a national organisation called CECPSC, which delivers self-help, one-to-one and counselling offer. That service is being decommissioned as of the end of this month, because across Humber Coast and Vale, it's not been sufficiently well taken up by children and young people, and the money has not been available across the ICS to recommission it. There'll be some work done this year, which will be co-produced with young people, to have a look at what the replacement offer needs to look like, so that it is an offer that is fit for and used by children and young people across Humber Coast and Vale. In the meantime, we are able to access Childline, which has a very strong one-to-one counselling offer, which is delivered digitally. So it's not about self-help websites, it's about how service is provided. And some young people, and I'm sure Carol will talk about this, some young people really like it and some people don't. And we have to look very much at how we are going to work with individual children, how we commission to meet needs, but work with the individual child and not simply tell them that this is the offer and this is what you will get, rather than try and look at how we meet their individual needs and concerns.
Thank you, Susan. Can I turn to Councillor Baker, please?
There we go. I've unmuted. I jumped across the screen. I wasn't where I was before.
Thank you, moved.
Chair. Okay, so yeah, I've got a myriad of questions. It's difficult to know where to start, really. But considering, along with the review group members, We wrote the draft report that's been mentioned this evening. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points that are relevant from that, and also from what the public speaker, Councillor Kilbane, contributed at the beginning, just to answer a couple of the things he mentioned. It might sound, not particularly a big deal, but the rationing aspect of services. As a review group, we were reassured that City of York Council does not ration services. So that would have been one of our recommendations, and it would be good to have some reassurance that rationing isn't going on within the council. Another key theme within what we found which was basically a fact-finding report, that the review group interviewed various stakeholders and young people. There was a big focus on data and a paucity of data, and there being no common data set, and this was a running theme. So I thank you, Susan and Carol, for coming today with the up-to-date data that we've asked for. One of the recommendations that we sort of were coming to was that we would like to see localized specific data published, reported to the council, perhaps to this committee or perhaps to the Mental Health Partnership on a quarterly basis from the CCG. So again, if that's possible, that would be something I think we'll be looking towards. My question though, and my main theme and area of concern is what children want and their preferences. Councillor Taylor has just mentioned something to do with the digital services. You don't want me to rant about that, but I don't feel comfortable with that being a key part of an offer either. Everything more and more things online. One of the things the children told us, so young people told us when we interviewed them, was that they are experiencing fatigue of online everything, overload of information, it not being a healthy way to live your life, doing everything online. So my overall question is, could you, in terms of children's voice, and I really hope we'll get on to hearing from some of the young people from York Mind who have joined us today. There was a survey recently called Growing Up in North Yorkshire. So I wonder whether the council is incorporating the results of that, specifically the questions about what children are saying about their mental well-being and what they need. Are you going to be looking at the results of that survey that has a massive reach and a huge sample of children in York, and are the results ready, and will we be able to see some useful stuff coming out of that on what children are saying? I guess to Jamila.
Yeah, so Councillor, I haven't seen the end report of the survey yet, but absolutely, we do not want to commission services that are not going to be useful to children. And the majority of the commissioning that we want to do is to co-produce it. So we're no longer looking at, building specifications and commissioning in that traditional way, but listening to the voice of the child and the young person about what services we do need in place. So absolutely got my commitment there. The other thing I wanted to raise is about rationing services. Absolutely not. It's not what we would do as a council or as commissioners to ration services. This is we're a council that supports children depending on their needs and making sure that they have the right service in place. Do we commission all the right services? Maybe we need to look at redesigning some of the services, but absolutely. We actually support children with the needs they want. And that survey, as you said, will really give us a good start in saying, how can we start to deliver services in a slightly different way than the traditional models at the moment?
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to move to Councillor Fenton. I've just got 4 more questions, 4 more raised hands to come to. Councillors Fenton, Vassy and Webb. And I see Sophia wants to have a word. So I'll take you all in order. Councillor Fenton, please.
Thanks, Chair. It was just a question around, I suppose, some of the context to some of the issues that that young people are facing. Obviously, the council has interaction with with families through various various settings and various interactions. And I just wondered to what extent we talk about early identification and prevention, to what extent through the existing interactions with with families that we are able to identify children who are potentially at risk of experiencing mental ill health, and being able to put in place support, or to signpost to sources of help and support. So I suppose it's probably one more for Jamila as to how we can be as joined up as we can as a council in terms of supporting children, not necessarily through through some of the routes referred to in the report, but perhaps through some of the other interactions that we have with families. Thank you.
Jamila?
Oh, I'm just waiting. I don't know whether to reply straight away. So absolutely, a child does not live in isolation, and we've set up what's called a community resilience board. So when we were talking about early intervention and prevention, around how we can support communities at that earlier level to support each other, and around housing. So Susan mentioned around housing having a big impact. We know as we go through the year, there's going to be fuel poverty, the living wage will rise, but equally we'll have NI insurance concerns. So we have to look at all that, what will potentially impact a child and young person as we go through the next 12 months. And working with the other corporate directors within the council, we don't work in isolation, council, around the commissioning of services and making sure that we actually include all those elements and those health inequalities. I think what improvements we've made in the council is around data and being able to look at where our health inequalities are pertaining to adults and children, where those needs are, and how we can commission those in particular parts around the city and at ward-based level. And that's what we're moving to, because sometimes it's not all about commissioning the right mental health services, you said. It's about commissioning the right support within families to support the reduction or even prevention of mental and emotional well-being.
Right, thank you very much. Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, a few points. I've enjoyed reading the report and the discussion. In terms of third sector, when we were having our meetings, one of the things that came up was the potential for maybe the third sector to be involved where schools maybe lack a sufficiency of skilled personnel to help within the school. So that's just as a point of information to members. That was something that came up. The second point I'd like to make is about a changing world. This really came home to me when we were talking about eating disorders. And we looked at the past where there were a set of established eating disorders that people were broadly familiar with, anorexia and bulimia, etc. And then we were told, but things change. And now we're seeing an increase in young people suffering from ARFID, which for those who are not aware of it, is avoidant or restrictive food intake behavior. And we discussed how that actually relates to our changing world and the shifting anxieties that come to our world. So, for example, climate change and people's anxieties about what they should and shouldn't eat, impact on their engagement with food. And we touched on in our meeting the way in which preventative education, information early on in schools can help with education to seek to avoid those kinds of disorders becoming increasingly prevalent. So that was something else that we looked at. My third quick point would be access and isolation. Councillor Baker and Jamali have both spoken about data, as have others. it became clear in our discussions that we had maybe hitherto relied on national data sets, and that we had a general vagueness on more specific data that relates to the demographics in our own wards across the city. In particular, for me, one of the things that struck home, as it always does, is that people tend to think of those who live in villages as being comparatively well off, and I suppose, broadly speaking, they are. But there's also an isolated rural poor who, once they leave school, they go to villages where they have no access to even a bus service to take them to someone who they could meet to discuss their mental health problems. And I know that's just one version of the kind of challenges there are across the city in all the wards. So I very much welcome us developing more localized data sets that enabled us to have a better engagement with local people's needs in different parts of our city. The last point I'd like to make, and it's a question really, is again, it's touched on what other people have said. This year we may be subsumed into the Humber Coast and Vale Integrated Care Board. We've heard at previous meetings of the Health Committee that there may be risks from that to us if we don't have real clarity in our vision and strategy for York, because we don't yet know whether even our executive member for health will be on that board. We don't know if scrutiny committees will have any part to play in that wider health system that's going to be set up. So I'd very much welcome thoughts from our professionals here as to whether you think there's more that we should be doing to prepare for that by having more clarity about the outcomes we seek for our young people in the years ahead on mental health issues.
If I could come back on that last point, the last point that Councillor Vassie has made initially, I think probably it's important to have a very clear understanding of what the local outcomes, what the local vision is, irrespective of the structure, some of the structures around, for example, ICB, because for either reason, being very clear about what you want for your children and young people is going to drive policy, it's going to drive investment, it's going to drive how we organise and how we commission. So it's absolutely crucial, and I shouldn't be driven by changes in one sector to do this. It is important for in discussions at the ICB to be very clear about what it is we want, and I absolutely agree with that, but I don't think it's the driving reason why we should be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take Councillor Webb, Sophia and Councillor Heaton in turn, and then I would like to move on to give Carol Redmond a chance to present Annex 1 on page 15 of our agenda papers. So Councillor Webb, all yours.
Thank you, Chair. First, I think part of this meeting is looking at recommendations that we can take back to the CEC scrutiny. And I would agree with Councillor Baker's recommendation of better data being brought into scrutiny. And whether that goes into, for example, in paragraph 9, the Mental Health Partnership Board, or where that data goes, I'm not sure, but I was wondering if we could explain a little bit about what we could get hold of on a regular basis, how regular that would be, and whether it would come and where it would go within the council, because I think that'd be something that would be really worth exploring. And then my other point would be about this word rationing. If we've got a situation where, as we've already established, only 45% we're only funding for 45% at best, or we're funding for 35%, but we're doing 45% of the work, and we've got waiting lists, you know, and we've got a situation where we have sort of thresholds for care. Surely that is in itself a form of rationing. And I just wondered, is there a specific definition of rationing and that we're not doing, or are we doing? How do we establish that? If we've got a situation where we have need that we're not currently fulfilling, then surely again there is rationing going on.
Chair, if I may pick this one up as an immediate thought, and Jamila will almost certainly have some thoughts about this as well. I haven't seen the draft, so it's a little difficult for me. But to my mind, I would interpret rationing as a decision that, for example, we will only see 200 children this year with emotional low anxiety, low mood or anxiety, and once we've seen 200, that's it. I mean, there are parts of the NHS where rationing does work in that way for a variety of reasons, but mental health and children's mental health in Vale of York is not one of them. We do not ration to a given number. We have a budget envelope within which we have to work, and that budget envelope is a combination of sources of funding, whether it's from the help, whether it's from health or education or social care or other sources. And that budgeted envelope is not, and I make no bones about this, it is not sufficient to enable us to do to the level we want to do everything we do want to do. If to quote a cabinet minister from some years ago, I could shake the magic money tree, then I would happily do so, and I would have a very long list of things that I would want to invest in. But we don't have that luxury in any funded sector at the moment. What we do have, and what we do need to work better on, is how we make the best use of the funding that we do have. And that's part of the reason that we've decided through the recent discussions at the North Yorkshire and York Mental Health Summit to look at how we put in a different offer in one part of the city to pilot in order to establish what are the outcomes for that and what are the benefits of that, and how we can take pressure off specialist CAMs by ensuring that there is a better and more robust offer further upstream. But it has to be said, we put... I can only speak for the CCG's level of investment, but I've mentioned a figure of coming to the order of getting on for £1 million over the last 4 years or so. And that is within terms of a mental health investment budget, which is itself now £1 million over committed within health. And we're having to take some very hard decisions about how we prioritise mental health spending within that. And we've chosen this for next year to prioritise areas of children's mental health funding because they are seen as being the most important. And I have commissioning colleagues in adult mental health who are not altogether happy about that. But we have made a decision to prioritise spend for children next financial year. So, but as I said, I can only speak for CCG funding in relation to that.
Thank you, Susan. Jamila, do you want to add anything to Susan's comments?
No, I think she's been she's answered it very comprehensive, and I just want to say that we don't ration care, because I think Susan's definition around the rationing of care, you have a limit of a number of children who can access service, and then it's closed, and that's like rationing care. We do have thresholds or eligibility criteria to ensure that children go to the right service at the right place. So you might have an eligibility criteria around what services children, young people access, but certainly not that they cannot access them at the time that they need them.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just get an answer on my other question about, what data could we get on a regular basis and where that data would go?
So, Councillor Webb, is that in terms of the commissioning and the outcomes of what we commission and how many individuals use that? Absolutely, we can get that to you. At the moment, we are devising a performance report that will go to CMT, but there's no real reason why we can't share that performance report with other council members. So once we've completed that report, because it's the first time that we're pulling all the data together, and once we have that, we're happy to share that with you.
Thank you, Jamila, because honestly, this getting the data just in front of us in this report is a real step forward. Will that include waiting times?
It will include waiting times, and I think we'll come on to the point where Carol, they're just doing an exercise of some data cleansing to make sure that we get the waiting times right and how we manage those. But I'll leave that when Carol does her presentation to come to.
Yeah, not far away now. Thank you very much, Jamila. Sophia, welcome. I understand you're a member of the York Youth Parliament, or York Youth Council. You're very welcome to join us tonight, and we can then hear your views. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, I would just like to say that I think it's amazing that conversations like these and scrutinies like these are happening. When we did our Make Your Mark report, which was basically it is the largest youth survey. It's nationwide, and we found that the top result for what young people thought were issues that need to be tackled was mental health. It was a top issue for locally in York, and it was a top issue for nationally across the UK. So it's great that these kind of conversations are happening in the first place. Something I wanted to just link back to was what Councillor Baker and Councillor Taylor said, to do with the link between online support and in-person support. Speaking from personal experience, very recently my school has just rearranged how they do the support system, and something that they've brought in is the link between in-person and online as something where you have an email address and an online place to reach out and say, I need help and I need support, and then it moves from online into person, and it kind of just helps with that barrier of actually approaching someone in person and saying, I'm really struggling. That can feel quite intimidating and nervous for young people at school to actually go up to someone and say, I'm having problems. So I just wanted to ask if that's something that link between the both of them and moving from online to in person, if that's something that maybe other schools or other systems are using, how they're using it, and if it's something that could be used more often, because even this morning when it was first announced, there was such positive feedback from students, and it made everyone feel like everything was a lot more manageable and approachable, rather than that feeling of having to go and knock on someone's door and say, like, this is what I'm dealing with.
Thank you.
Sorry, my last point.
Yes,
obviously this is my first time in something like this, so I'm not entirely sure how it all works.
You're doing very well.
Thank you. The other point I just wanted to ask about was there's a lot of talk about support for people with like diagnosed and very serious mental health issues, which is of course amazing, but there is also lots and lots of people at schools and young people's in and around York who maybe haven't got a direct diagnosis, but they are showing like early symptoms and they are still struggling. And it might not be a doctor's note, but it's still something that they in their lives is very, very serious, and it can be taking over so much of their lives. Is there some kind of support, or is there plans to help those people who maybe aren't top of the list, maybe don't have a diagnosis, but are also struggling day to day with anxiety, even early symptoms of eating disorders and really serious issues like that?
Thank you, Sophia. It's very, very, very plain and very clear. Thank you very much. Jamila, would you perhaps be the best person to respond to Sophia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some really good comments made there, particularly around the schools and using digitalization and making those requests for face-to-face is really helpful. I think we're going to roll that across schools. But the second point that, and more importantly, a raise around, that early intervention, children and young people who are experiencing anxiety and stress. We've already got some services in place. I think, Sophia, one of those you mentioned around the school support and the school's mental wellbeing service, but equally within our joint commissioning plan together with Susan and the CCGs, we've got a lot around the I Thrive model, which we mentioned right earlier on in the report about getting help and getting early help, because we understand those children and young people who do get a diagnosis and get the support wrapped around them, but it's a number of children that we now have that are facing anxiety, stress, low mood, that we're tackling with a new model of enhancing your mind, looking at how we can enhance our wellbeing service. And Susan, equally, the CCGs are supporting that early intervention approach as well.
Love it.
Absolutely. And we were perhaps a little unusual in 2016 when we got money through Future in Mind in terms of putting the large chunk of that money into schools-based support. And in York, every school has access to the school wellbeing service, and that service can work with school staff in advising school staff to themselves respond to and work with children with concerns around their emotional and mental health, or works with with pupils directly. So, Sophia, there is access in every school to direct help and advice and support from trained staff. Some schools in York now have access to the mental health support team, the Wellbeing in Mind service, and their remit is broadly the same, to work with school staff and to work with individual pupils. For me, it's an incredibly important part of the offer. In many parts of the country, it's not so well picked up. And I think York has got a very strong and robust offer based in schools. And it's an area that we want to see extended and worked through. Not all of our children who need this help are in school. So we have to be aware that we've got children who are electively home educated or not well enough to be in school who may need this kind of access as well. So we've got to broaden some of the reach there. But we've also got to ensure that our pupils can access early information, early advice, and early interventions, because CAWL's service is simply not set up to respond to everybody, and not everybody should be wanting to go up to a clinic and sit in a clinic counselling room with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a mental health nurse. There are lots of other skill sets and lots of other people who have huge skills in working with our children and people, and they are not by any stretch of the imagination all have to be based at specialist CAMs.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to take just one more question now before I go to Carol Redmond to talk about Annex 1. Councillor Heaton, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Sir, for what you're saying about schools there. A comment first, if I may. It is always very difficult for people to go up and say, I need help. And I say this as someone who has had that conversation. It's also important to recognise that sometimes young people who are in the middle of these sorts of issues don't realise it, and there may be these situations where others can see it and they can't. So we need people to be watching out for that as well. That's absolutely critical. And in terms of schools, we talk about COVID. I used to be a teacher, and I saw a number of students having breakdowns simply because the pressures that school itself, and particularly the style of education that has been brought in over recent years, was doing to them. So there's those factors that we need to consider as well. But I do have a question. And just looking at the figures, obviously, for what TUVE are doing, just come back to that. In that context, where we're looking at 35%, and then we're actually having to operate at 45%, and the difficulties that's bringing in, I speak to a lot of mental health trusts across the country, and staffing is always a big issue when we come to that. So it's not just putting the money in, it's the staffing to deal with it at the front line. Those figures, what's the current context of staffing at TUVE that we're seeing there?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please, Carol.
Yeah. So in terms of our staffing levels, I think as Susan has mentioned, I think we have been prioritised in terms of funding over the last few years from the CCG, and which has been very welcome. But the reality is the available staff to recruit to is really difficult. So it's great that across our system we've set up the schools-based teams, but what happens is that they then deplete the generic teams, who would be our experienced staff, in order to set up the schools-based team. So there's a big kind of training initiative looking at kind of setting up children's wellbeing workers. Various roles have been developed, but I think we're going to need to be really creative in terms of how we expand our workforce, because I think some of the very traditional roles, the staff are just not available in those anymore.
Thanks, Carol. And just to be clear, I haven't worked with TUVE, one of those situations, but it is something in terms of having to be creative that I've seen in different parts of the country, because there are shortages all over the place, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I just wonder if I could come back on this point about targets, because there's always a concern that we assume that TUVE for example, TUVE aren't treating enough children. The target of 35% was dreamt up somewhere in Whitehall. And it dreamt up as a means of ministers being able to see that there was a figure that justified their expenditure on money. And this is future in mind money. So we moved from 32%, which was a figure that came out of a calculation somewhere, population calculation, and it came out that for the money that was represented by Future in Mind, we ought to be able to move from to a target of treating 35% of children with a diagnosable mental health disorder. There was no basis prior to the choice of that figure of knowing how many children were in fact being treated. And we still do not, in fact, know how many children need treating outside of a set of prevalence statistics, which are simply that they are statistics and are useful for planning purposes. We also should be aware that TUVE are treating 45%, slightly variable through the year, of children with a high level of need. But we do not know whether, in fact, they are treating 55% or 75% of the children in York, because this is not an exact science. Nobody has counted up the number of children in the area who have a definite mental health disorder, and then that aligned that to the number that TUVE are treating. So we do have to treat these figures with caution, because they are statistical. They are statistics, and we can't assume that the numbers of children who are going through TUVE what proportion of children who need any kind of support represent. And certainly we cannot with clarity estimate to what extent they represent the number of children locally who need TUVE's level of support, if that makes sense to members. But it can be one of those very difficult issues around statistics. And I know sometimes how hard it is dealing with statistics that the local authority is required to deliver back to the department, that they represent a statistical understanding of the local community and maybe not the actual profile of the local community. And I don't know whether it's an underestimate or an overestimate, but I think we just have to be careful about being overly focused on what is essentially a statistical figure.
Thank you very much, Susan. Can I now thank Carol, excuse me, Carol Redmond of CAMS for her Annex 1 on page 15 of the agenda papers, covering the level of referrals signposted by specialist CAMS. There's also a presentation on demand for services with children's mental health sent this afternoon, which I hope you've all managed to see. Would you like to take us through that material, please, Carol?
Yeah, do you want me to share the presentation that it's?
If you would, thank you.
Yeah, is that shared?
Not yet.
No.
Can one of the technical team assist here?
Hi, it's Richard Jackson from the technical team. Yeah. Hi, Carol. There should be a green button on the bottom that says share screen. And then if you click on that and then highlight the application which you want to share, which will be PowerPoint.
Is that shared now?
No, I do have a copy of it if you'd like me to
Perfect.
share it, and then you can just ask me to move on to the next slide.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do that. And this is the children's mental health considerations by County Council, young people, etc. Is that the right one?
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So to introduce myself, I'm Carol Redmond. I'm the head of service for CHUV CAMS, covering North Yorkshire and York, but this presentation is going to focus on the York element of our offer. If you move on, thank you. So this, I think one of the things that CHUV have tried to do, and hopefully I think it's given Susan in particular a better line of sight, is really be transparent where our waiters are and where we're really thinking about how we move our services to the front end. So in between April 2021 and December 2021, the number of children receiving treatment was just under 2,000. I don't think it is 20,000, I think that's a typo. The percentage of children with an eating disorder, we have seen an exponential rise in referrals for eating disorders. I think that's something that nationally has been the case, and I think particularly for our services, we've also seen an increase in admissions for children with an eating disorder. So that's not a surprise to see that, but it does mean that then hitting the access and waiting times is more challenging if you've got significantly more referrals than was anticipated. In terms of our general assessments, as you can see, the time bands are there. Sometimes the delay in waiting for the first assessment to take place is for receiving information back either from families or from other parts of the system, but we do endeavour to see people as quickly as possible. In terms of our autism assessment, we have done a lot of work trying to improve our timescales for autism, and we have also had additional funding from the CCG to look at a waiting list initiative around that. So in North Yorkshire, autism assessments for children are completed by the retreat. So Susan and colleagues have provided additional funding for us to ask the retreat to provide some assessments for us. In order to select the children who will go to the retreat, we have done the primary assessment, so really understand what the needs are for those children and make sure that the children that are transferred to the retreat are presenting purely with that type of presentation. So we're really thinking about any kind of other associated mental health problems or risks with that. Can you move on, please? In terms of our demand, as you might anticipate, when COVID first happened, there was a real drop in referrals into service. I think as colleagues have mentioned, I think when the world was really trying to understand it wasn't a priority to refer in. It was also a time, I think, when schools were readjusting, and schools would be some of our main referrers into service. But then over time, the referrals have picked back up. And as you can see, we're heading back to the peak for referrals coming into service. In terms of some of the predictions or the forecasting regarding need, I think there's an anticipation from forecasting that the Trust has done of a 52% increase over the next 5 years in children presenting with mental health difficulties. And again, that isn't presenting to CHUV, it's presenting to the system as a whole, but a proportion of which will come into CHUV in terms of the increasing need across the system. Okay. I'm happy to move on. Thank you. This is looking at our total number of referrals. I think the big jump at the end, please don't be misled by that. That's around some internal work we've been doing in terms of reorganising our teams. It really hasn't shot up by that much in 2 months. But there will be some increase, but it isn't quite as it's represented there. But as you can see, it kind of usually kind of hits around kind of 300, 350 a month kind of referrals coming through. In terms of our CAMHS crisis team, in July last year, that service went to a 24/7 service. I think one of previous comments was around a support line. When COVID was set up, the trust established a 24/7 mental health support line, which also works with our children's crisis team as well. So anyone ringing into TUV for either an adult or child crisis response will go through that helpline in the first instance, and then referrals are passed into the most appropriate place. We did see a drop in demand over the December period, which is often, schools are feeling less pressurised. But I think that's something that we're seeing an increase again in terms of crisis demand. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I think our eating disorders cases have gone up. So initially, when the service was commissioned, we were commissioned across North Yorkshire and York to manage around 80 referrals in the first instance. And what we know is that just in City of York alone, or just in Vale of York alone, sorry, we had 204 referrals from July 20 to December 21, which clearly is an increase of what we initially were asked to provide, and then a more significant increase since COVID. Okay, thank you. The autism referrals, I think that has kind of ticked along. I think our waiting times for autism over the last couple of years has improved, and I think will continue to improve, especially with the additional capacity being offered by the retreat. I think some of the things we needed to do in our autism delivery was really think about how we could adapt what we needed to do. I think some of what you would be asked to do for an autism referral is you'd look at kind of home setting, school setting and clinic setting, and clearly in COVID times that was not a possibility, so we needed to adapt and really think about how we could do the school assessment traditionally in a kind of home setting. So I think a lot of work has gone on across the trust to develop a system called ROSCO, which allows for that remote access of assessments, and it's something that we're now doing more face-to-face assessments, but it's still going to be a blended model, which I think means that we can often do more assessments in the time frame that we have. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
In terms of,
here's another one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Just in terms of referrals, again, this is just demonstrating where the referrals have been, and that it is kind of on a down tick currently, but it is something that kind of does continue to be challenging for us when you look at the first part of where the norms were. Okay. So what we do whilst children are waiting to access services, we, at the point of our single point of access service, speaking to the referrer or speaking to parents primarily, and we'll look at kind of what are the risks that are presenting, and we'll look at really thinking about, so what's the level of priority we want to assign. We then, when people are not actively involved in the service, we have what's called our KIT processes, which is our keeping in touch process, to really think about how do we make sure that if people need to be brought into service, that we do that as speedily as possible, depending on their need. All children in York, as has already been said, can access the school wellbeing service, and also can access York Mind counselling. Okay, and the other part of the question that I was asked to talk about was the CQC findings for CAMS. So there's a couple of slides on that, if that's okay. Okay, so we at the Children's Services were part of the inspection. So we also received a Section 29A letter, which is I suppose a signal regulation notice of more concerns, if you like, from what they found from the inspection a couple of years ago to the more recent inspection. So if you want to go on to the next slide. I'm sorry, that's really small. Can people read that? Okay. So the overall rating for the trust was requires improvement. The trust was rated good for being caring and effective, but required improvement for being well led, responsive and safe. Whilst clearly we're not happy with that, it does give us kind of some opportunity to really think about what can we do to continue to improve, and indeed one of the adult services, the crisis and health-based places of safety, so the 136 weeks, actually did increase from requires improvement to good. They were by no means complacent and really know that we need to improve other areas. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? So specifically thinking about CAMS, what was addressed in the Section 29 letter was systems around children who were waiting for treatment, and I think some of the concerns that colleagues have already mentioned, and also our mandatory training compliance. The other target that we needed to address, or another area of concern, was regarding how we keep in touch with people waiting for treatment and how we have a systematic approach to that. So next slide. So in terms of what we've done quite a lot of work around our caseload analysis, really think about how do we manage our vacancy factor, as previously mentioned, as well as our increase in demand, and have clinicians working with workable caseload sizes, which is obviously a really difficult balancing act when there's the risk is that waiting times will increase. We struggle to recruit across all professions, and we're now looking at how can we use some agency support. So there's the outsourcing work that I mentioned previously, but we're also looking at how can we employ some agency workers to join our team in order to help us get through some of the backlog. We're continuing to think about how can we be more streamlined, thinking about our keeping in touch processes, and we're kind of working with children, young people and families to tell us about their experience of that. Because I guess sometimes we might have kept in touch with them, but we're not necessarily offering an appointment to start the helping journey. So I think we know that that's still a challenge for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've just had a suggestion from Councillor Baker that we invite the Elizabeth's guest tonight, Helen and Tasha, to speak. Are they there, and do they wish to speak to the committee?
Hi, so I'm Elizabeth Hewitt and I am the Systems Change Manager at York Mind, and I've been joined by Helen and Tasha, two young people from our Young People's Steering Group. They both have lived experience of mental ill health in York, and they've come with me today. They do work across all of our projects, and they also in the past have run their own campaigns to do with mental health in York. So I don't know if you want to say anything about your experiences or whether you want to address the committee. Is there anything you want to address?
Do you want to do a process?
Do you want me to run through my report now, or do you want me to take questions for Carol?
I'm just conscious that we have been going almost almost 2 hours now, so If you're happy to wait a little bit longer, then we can take some questions to Carol and then to come back to you, if that's all right, or if you do need to go, then do say.
We've got about 45 minutes. We need to lock the building up at 8 o'clock, I'm afraid. So we're okay for a little bit, but not too long.
All right. In that case, can members save their questions then for Carol, and we'll turn to Elizabeth now and her two guests. Okay, Elizabeth.
Okay, so I'm the Systems Change Manager here at York Mind, and we received some funding via the Co-op for their resilience programme. We submitted a hypothesis to them that said that we have a bottleneck in services. Obviously, we have lots of young people who require services and are referred into services, and there are only so many that get through, and it's creating that bottleneck in York. We were allocated the funding and we carried out research. We interviewed 12 young people, in-depth qualitative interviews, and also 13 stakeholders, which were a variety of people from GPs to teachers to CAM staff, as well as some of our own staff here. Some of the things that we identified are things that you have already brought up today in our research. That young people simply don't know what to do, where to go, or who to speak to about their mental health. That they feel they have no voice and they're not being heard. That there is a range of stigma and fear about reaching out for help. And we, in some of our interviews with parents of young people as well, that came across as well. There's a lack of personal connections and that they feel left in limbo. And that obviously we're experiencing burnout in the workforce too. So we came up with a range of questions from that research, and we put them to back to our stakeholders, and also we ran some workshops with young people, and they came up with a series of suggestions of how we could address some of these issues in York, and we are putting the funding for the project into those things. So what we are currently working on is building a website that is solely for young people's mental health in York, and it will have a range of things on there, from referral processes to where they can get help to self-help. There's going to be a section on it where they can create their own plan of how to help themselves. There'll also be guided breathing activities. And in terms of a question that was asked earlier about whether or not people who require mental health support, whether a website's going to do anything for them, this is very much for early help and intervention. Yes, there will be signposting to services and even crisis services, but there will also be how you can help yourself now and start to put those processes in place to yourself. The website is written from the point of view of we are talking you through this process. When we have spoken to young people, they very much want their hand held through the process and through their own journey of living their mental health. And so we are writing the website as if we are talking to them about conditions, about where they can get help, even things of like safe spaces of where they can go and speak to people about their health, about their mental health, but what does the front door look like? And who's going to be there to greet you? We are also working on an information campaign, which is going to be primarily delivered in secondary schools from us here at York Mind. One of the things that young people said to us is, it's fair enough a teacher standing up there and talking about mental health, but they're there to teach us, they're there to educate us. And what we want is somebody who works in mental health to come in and speak to us as a whole. Fortunately, some of the things that we can't do is that part of this process was that they wanted a training programme for teachers and for GPs and ambulance staff and police staff about mental health. And that's something that, unfortunately, within the limits of this project, we don't have the funding to do that. But we are looking at the awareness campaign in schools. And what the young people also suggested is a campaign of positive stories, that we talk about mental health and we talk a lot about those issues, but they don't have any examples of people who've accessed services and it has made a difference to. You know, the struggle to access services is a bigger voice than those people who've accessed services and have actually received the help that they needed. And so they wanted us to put something out there on that side of things. Now, as we've gone through this project and the funding and have consulted with some companies that actually do that for us, we don't think we can stretch to it. And so we're actually, instead of a videos or a series of videos, we are going to look at a podcast that can be part of the website. We have got 3 young people advisors that are on board to help us with the website. One of them is looking specifically about accessibility, and they've brought us some really good ideas about how different people with different mental health conditions would access this website, down to simple things like changing the colour scheme. You know, we select larger text or we select a different language, but actually selecting a colour scheme so it's easier for you to read is something that's going to be on there. But also a button that says like talk to me, and they can actually, the page can be read to them if they're really struggling, if they're panicking, then they can be read to them. So we've got some young people, as well as all of these ideas having come from the young people and the stakeholders, we are constantly keeping that co-production element in this project as well.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. In terms of questions, the first one that I see indicating is Anne Coyle. Do you want to address the committee, Anne?
Pardon, it was less of a question and more of a kind of well done. That sounds amazing and really wonderful to hear young people's views and thoughts and ideas about that. So you had a bit of a clap and a bit of a thumbs up from me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. Councillor Webb.
Yeah, I'll be far more dull and ask a question, but no, I think that that is based on what we've heard so far tonight. I think there is this worry about just stuff going online and that being, you know, a concern for your people and a concern for others. That actually, is that someone being seen? Is that something that's helpful, or is that just literally a website? But what I've got to say is, it sounds like a far better attempt to get this right with a much more informative and useful website going forward. I will say, I mean, as I said at the start, I am a school teacher, and nothing, sadly, as much as I think I'm really good, nothing is going to turn students off a particular website more than me telling them about it. And I think that it's an interesting point that's been made about training for staff, whether that's in schools or other areas as well. I can understand how that would be really, really expensive, but I wonder what options there are to explore around that, because I think it's something that, even if it was training about what mental health is, but it's also training about how young people interact with information provided by adults. I think it'd be good to have that information and that training provided, and any training really would be really, really beneficial. So just like if you've got any thoughts around what would be most useful, that'd be really, really helpful in terms of training. Thank you.
Do you two want to think, because you previously did the training that was delivered, so do you want to think about a response to that in a second? If you want to go out and confer, you can do. If you want to come back in, you can. Just to address the issue around well, what you've just said about what would help in terms of that funding, it purely, like you said, how do we get the third sector more involved? Well, if somebody's got some funding out there and wants to give us some, and then we can roll that training out, we can design it and develop it, then we'd be more than happy to. In terms of the website, that's exactly what young people have said to us. Like, we don't want a teacher to talk to us about this. We want somebody who works in the mental health services to come in and speak to us about it. So we're hopefully going to be able to do that within the remit of this project.
That's great. Thank you very much. Jamila, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to come in and more of a an opportunity to reach out and just meet with you, Elizabeth, to see what that actual training would look like, how you know, the way it would be delivered, the cost of it. A conversation outside of this committee would be really helpful, so we can explore that.
Yeah, I'll leave my email address in the chat before we go.
Thank you very much. Do Helen and Tasha want to say anything before we move on?
Yeah, I'll just say a point about the training and who it's for. I suppose I know Councillor Webb is obviously a teacher and obviously brings that up, and I suppose there's been a lot of focus on things delivered in school. Obviously, you're going to catch majority of young people coming up through there. But I think I would also like to just take this opportunity to point out about the young people who aren't in educational training. And quite often, like, it makes sense, it goes hand in hand that they're actually the most vulnerable with their mental health if you're not in a school situation. And also asked Elizabeth earlier, we weren't 100% sure what you would define as a young person. Obviously, at York Mind, it goes up to 25, and that's something I would feel very strongly about, because I got through the bottleneck of CAMS, if you like, when I was younger, and then the transition into adult services was very, very difficult for me. And so I'd like to really hammer home the point of where you can have it, say, if it's going to be within statutory services, if you're going to have a transfer at 18 to make sure that any other services around actually are there for a transitional service. And I'd like to, but maybe leave you with the thought of whatever you do in your particular role as to how you can make that transition easier at 18.
That's great, thank you very much. Councillor Baker, do you want to make a point?
I'd just like to, thank you, Chair, ask Helen and Tasha a broader question. As I've got you here, I can't resist. Thank you very much for joining us as young advisors in your project. Thank you for coming and joining our group of councillors tonight. It's great that you were willing to do so. And from the report, all the themes and the questions you've been asking, there's quite a lot about information giving and the services and the treatment that might be available to help young people. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the most protective factors? That's literally what would make life better for children as a whole. So I'm talking long before any sort of low level intervention and the sort of getting help and advice stage. What do you think would make a difference in children's lives to make it less stressful? And did you have was there anything coming out of your research so far where children were saying, well, actually what we need to stay healthy and well is this, or what we don't have is that, in life in general?
I think maybe I remember when I started going through mental health issues, obviously trauma happens, and I think not pushing trauma aside, you should never sort of dissociate from that, because I think that makes it worse. But for me personally, I think it's socializing with other people who have similar sort of problems. Because I know that makes it a lot easier for some people to understand how it is. Obviously, different backgrounds and things make it slightly more different for each other, but I think that has especially worked best for a lot of people that I know. On my university course, there's a lot of people with mental health issues, and I just organised a little get-together on Friday, and people really enjoyed it because we were all part of a team and we were able to be ourselves, be open about things. And I think that really does help. I know that's not always at the early stage if you don't understand what mental health you have, but I think it's always a good place to start, being able to socialise with people.
I was sort of thinking about, I suppose, sort of social issues in terms of, I suppose I was thinking about diversity and inclusion and that sort of thing. I suppose, certainly my experience is that it was quite it's a regimented, every kid in my town did the same thing. We all went to preschool at 3 and then school at 4, and we all were in the same class with the same, with the teacher, and it was all the very same experiences. And I wonder about if you're almost having a more holistic approach, I don't know, to lifestyle, even at that early age. I don't know, I'm just thinking about school being quite regimented, or that was certainly my experiences. And, you know, even as young as year 2, when you're 6 and 7 and you're doing a first set of SATs, and it's actually, there are kind of those sorts of external pressures that actually come in quite early that might be an underlying problem. I know that's been like a hot point for years, isn't it? Like, exams cause stress in kids, but no one seems to have an alternative. But yeah, I don't know.
Thank you very much. And Coyle.
My apologies, I should have said who I am, just because you don't know. My name is Anne Coyle and I'm the Interim Director for Children's Services. I can't tell you how humbling it is to be able to listen to the wisdom that you have, and how much you have to teach us. It's always a pleasure when you do a job like mine to have the wise words of young people. Jamila on the screen is also one of the other directors, and I think Jamila and I would really welcome meeting with you. So as she said earlier, if you stick your details in, we'll definitely have some time with you, if you can give us time, that is. I bet it's a real pleasure to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. If there are no more questions to Elizabeth and team, as it were, I'll go back to Carol. You're very welcome to stay with us, Elizabeth, as long as you wish. But I appreciate you may want to get off. Thank you very much for your input this evening. It's been much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. So I think Councillor Doughty's first in his questions to Carol. Councillor Doughty. You're on mute, sir.
Pressing the wrong button. Thanks, Chair.
You're very welcome.
Just if they're still on, thank you very much to Helen and Tasha and Elizabeth as well. It's really good to hear some personal experience, and thank you. And thanks to Carol. Actually, it's more of a statement than a question I'm going to make, and it's something I've said before in health scrutiny meetings. But the fact that Tuve and your colleagues have offered information forward, such as specifically about the CQC report, when your chief officer for the York area approached me as chair of the health scrutiny committee to tell us that, you know, there were some areas that you needed to improve on, and that was a really positive step, I thought, from what we've seen in the past, when certainly some predecessors, a different organisation used to run mental health services in York, we'd have never got that. So I want to say thank you, and it's a much more open environment, I think, now, and that's really positive. In terms of obviously your own improvements, I think we would want to hear in future at a later date, either yourself or Naomi, to come along to the Health Scrutiny Committee to give us a further update on the progress on the CAM services. And that might coincide with the next visit, or after the next visit to the CQC, possibly, because I'm guessing they will return to see that you're following the action.
Sure they will.
So that's all I want to say, really. But thank you, because it is a really positive thing that the system seems to be becoming more open. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Fenton.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Carol. You mentioned some of the issues that you are contending with in terms of recruitment problems as being one of the factors that is having an impact on being able to deliver the capacity that you need to. I just wondered whether from a workforce perspective, whether you're hopeful of that improving in terms of new people coming into the profession, or whether you can foresee a continued and maybe increased reliance on agency staff. And I know it's an issue that we've discussed on this committee in relation to other aspects of children's services, and it is a concern. So I just wondered whether you're hopeful for the future, or whether you can see the situation sort of remaining as it is, or getting worse. Thank you.
I think we know that there are some real known challenges, particularly around medical staff. So in order to respond to that, we're looking at how can we grow our non-medical prescribing workforce, and really thinking about how can we free up our medical workforce to really look at the most ill, the most kind of acute presentations, in order to do that well and provide a much more consultative model, and have other professionals who can do some of the more kind of routine working services. I think the psychological workforce and the different roles that have been developed there are something that we will need to embrace, and obviously want to embrace. So I think that will be a big change in that. I think in Scarborough and at St John's universities, they've increased their nurse training places, or rather they've established a nurse training course in St John's and in Scarborough. So I think we're looking at how can we proactively engage with them as trainees, and really think about making Camden an attractive place to work throughout their training, in order to then look at how can we grow the workforce together. I think in social work, and I guess Jamelia and I might not appreciate this, I think we're looking at how can we grow our social work workforce. We currently employ a number of social workers, but often in more generic roles. So to look at what could we do differently. I think in days gone by, when the role of a therapeutic social worker was around, I think that's something that's kind of been lost along the way, like a lot of those kind of roles. So I think we'll be looking at, is there anything more we can do that? How again can we build the expertise? But it's that risk of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and being really careful about not depleting somewhere else in order to plug the gaps that we might have.
Thank you, Carol. Councillor Webb.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. And I think that last point is really, really important, about robbing Peter to pay Paul, whoever they are. I think the fact of the matter is there's just not enough money in the system, is there? And that is no one's fault here. That is a national problem, and it's a real concern. I've got a couple of questions. One about the vacancies, just following on from what Councillor Fenton said. How many vacancies are we talking in the different sort of parts of the service? And then my other question is about rules and methods of referral. Obviously, we've had quite a large social experiment, I suppose, recently, in the sense that the normal method of referral through schools has been sort of limited reasonably. And have we noticed any changes, any positives, any negatives from alternatives to schools for referrals? And also, is there anything about self-referrals or family referrals? If we're empowering people to understand and recognise their own mental health more, how are we working on that sort of self-referral part as well?
We've accepted self-referrals probably for the last 3 or 4 years. I think when we say self-referral, they're often parental referral rather than young people approaching us, and then kind of negotiating, a phone call with the child after, or the young person afterwards. In terms of our workforce, I think we have currently available staff 48% of our workforce in the York team. So we're really depleted. That's alongside having 12 new recruits coming in, but any recruitment process will take 12 weeks plus. So we are depleted at the moment. In terms of referrals, I think we are really thinking about the conversations at the summit, and thinking about how can we have a more targeted approach to who does come through, because I think sometimes people come into service, wait for an assessment, and then are told really we're not the right service for you, which must be really frustrating for them, and also means that whilst they're waiting for us, they're not seeking help from other avenues. So we want to do some work to look at how can we improve our systems collectively to think about making sure the right young people are coming through the door rather than sitting and waiting, because I think the worry is the more children that we have waiting, the more risk there is that someone who really needs us is kind of held in a line which is not good for their mental health.
Thank you, Carol. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, so just in relation to money and where it's coming from, and before we as committee members were able to make any recommendations really to the council to help shape services and commissioning, could I ask how, is there any plans or allocations made already for the £100,000 of mental health investment that's in the current council plan? And if there are, could you let us know now? And if not, are we going to get a chance to be able to influence how that money is spent?
Sorry, who's that question to? Because I wouldn't know
maybe
about
Anne or Jamila. Is Anne still there? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't get
to take that one.
Oh yeah, I was going to say I couldn't get off mute then. So Councillor Baker, can you just repeat the last bit of that, because I just missed the last bit.
Whether the £100,000 for mental health investment in the council's budget is allocated yet, and if not, whether the committee members will be able to influence or take suggestions from tonight's meeting as to how that money is spent.
So some of the budget is clearly allocated, but however, there's always flexibility in the budget, hence why I spoke to, just had a conversation with Elizabeth to say, well, how best can we use that fund? So although it's allocated to go to particular projects, but a lot of the projects are very similar to the ones we were talking to about peer-to-peer support, about the low-level integration, about training into school. So it fits quite nicely with the plan for that 100,000 investment. But like I say, it's really flexible. I like to commission very flexibly and strategically around getting the right services in place. And we'll make those plans clear around how we commission those services going forward. But I'm really pleased to say that, you know, listening to the conversation and scrutiny and listening to Helen and Tasha, the move towards using that money is in very similar to the ways that they're actually recommending us to consider.
Thank you, Jamila. Do we have any further questions for our guest tonight, or officers, before I wrap things up? No, don't see any hands. So I'd like to thank everyone who's listened and presented reports to the Joint Committee this evening. And everyone, of course, who's contributed to the debate. Additionally, I'd like to thank our democracy officers and technical staff for staging this online meeting. As I said in my introduction, all the material will be available to the review group members, as they finalise the report into children and young people's mental health. Item 5 is urgent business. I have no urgent business for the committee. And therefore, thank you all once again for participating this evening, and I wish you a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.